It must feel a little like Godfather 3. Every time I think I'm out, they drag me back in.
I wasn't sure if you meant the end of the movie, because I don't want to die doing this.
I wasn't comparing you to Michael. Well, I guess I was. Yes, sorry about that. All right. But, you know, sometimes you have to do what you have to do. What's with the indictment?
First of all, hello, everyone. Thank you for having us to the Y. It's really, really nice to be with an in-person crowd. We've both had the privilege of doing it here for the last year with books, and it's nice to be back with Jeff. There's a couple indictments.
I meant the one.
You mean the one in Manhattan? All expectations and all indications are that he is going to be indicted. I do not anticipate that changing. Obviously, nothing is done until it's done. But what Trump was characterizing as some kind of a delay last week, I think, was actually just kind of a part of normal course of business, where they were getting things in order ahead of presenting to the grand jury for a vote. But it is a Donald Trump sleight of hand, where he tweeted on Saturday, or whatever he did, on Saturday on his social media website, claiming he was going to get arrested on Tuesday, which no one had said. Tuesday comes and goes, he doesn't get arrested, and then he starts putting out word that actually the case is falling apart, which doesn't appear to be based on anything. So I expect this is going to move along, but until it's done, it's not done.
I want to turn in a second to your non-global column about this. But the ex-president seems to be less than his usual calm and phlegmatic self about all this. He talked about death and destruction that would follow in the wake of his indictment. He posted a picture. On one side was the Manhattan DA, and what looked like right next to him was Donald Trump wielding a baseball bat. And there are reports that say he wants this. He wants a perp walk. He wants the picture of him. Is that possible? Is this?
Well, that's what he's claiming. I mean, what he's saying to people is, that he's going to lean into this, that this is, the Democrats, which is broadly what he says, are going to overplay their hand. Donald Trump has been trying to avoid being indicted or arrested for almost 45 years. So I don't actually think that he's excited about or really looking forward to this. And anybody who claims that he wants to be indicted is, I think, having a fantasy. I do think that he will, if that is the reality, try to make the most of it in a showy way to his advantage. I could see him selling T-shirts with a mugshot on it, but that's a different issue.
So there's this notion about that this could help him. I mean, we'll turn to his status, but certainly the polling doesn't indicate an impending indictment. Your last column was skeptical. You're saying, no, I'm not buying that this is actually not going to hurt him.
Yeah, I mean, I'm certainly not buying it. I will just start by saying thank you to everyone for being here, to the Y for having us. It's great to be back with the two of you. It's a pattern that you see, I think, in right-wing politics over and over, but particularly with Trump, where these sort of larger-than-life, outsized characters like a Newt Gingrich or a Sarah Palin become so tightly bonded to a big, big section of the country that they start to believe themselves and they start to persuade the broader media that as long as that bond remains really strong, anything that tightens that bond is ultimately good for them. And that's all well and good, except you're talking about like 30% of the country, right? Which is a whole lot in a Republican primary. But Donald Trump's goal here is not to win the Iowa caucus, it's to become president again. Or at least that's his stated goal. That's his stated goal, right. Ostensible goal. And if he does want to become president again, then this idea that being branded as a criminal on top of everything else is helpful to him. I'm just personally very skeptical, Jeff. Maybe it's very old-fashioned of me, but I do think that if you have a choice between running for president as a free man I would
just point out, this is a general thing that I think is applied for the last 20 years in American politics. The assertion about what the voters want has to take into account that we elect with an electoral college.
Yeah.
Because I don't think Trump has a shot at winning a popular vote, but depending on where these people are. But wait a minute, I picked up on something here. being the trained journalist that I am. Are you dubious that he in fact wants to be president again?
I'm dubious that he actually knows exactly what he wants other than to survive day to day. And I think part of the means to that end is having a presidential campaign as a shield and as an ongoing product line with the Republican. I want to break this to you. He doesn't think the way you and I do, and he doesn't think the way he doesn't think the way the vast majority of the people in this audience do. And the way that he is looking at everything is basically, how do I survive this or get out of this? And so I do think he misses the power of the office. That I think is very true. But it does not mean that I think that he is looking at what is the best way that I can position myself to get there. Now, I think Chris Christie had a line on ABC when this question of, when I was on with him a couple weeks ago, when this question of, is this going to help Trump? Christie's response was, and to Alex's point, well, what else is he going to say? You know, I mean, to say this really hurts me is the death knell. So I think he's going to keep this going as long as he can. But I will just make the point, to Alex's point about skepticism about whether he really wants to be branded a criminal. You know, the other moment that he kept insisting was going to help him was impeachment. He didn't get reelected last I checked. Now, granted, COVID played a role in that too. But what he did say to House Republicans before the impeachment vote was, it's not the kind of thing you want on your resume. I am confident that's true about an indictment too.
What we have seen, and now we're about to get to one of my pet peeves, and I will try not to speak for the rest of the evening. In the wake of all this, of course, apparently all the Republicans have felt the need to close ranks. Jim Jordan wants to subpoena the Manhattan DA to find out what his evidence is. This is an interesting concept of federalism. But it comes in the wake of this almost inevitable thing that happens at this stage in a campaign, where Ron DeSantis, who was the man of the hour 2 or 3 weeks ago, now the stories are Trump leads, is DeSantis finished? So in some sense, as Trump proceeds to an indictment, how has it happened that after the midterms, when he was blamed for picking bad candidates and raising bad issues, he now appears once again to be the overwhelming favorite of the rank and file, which may tell us, in fact, this is, as it has been for the last 5 years, his party?
I think there's no question that it's his party. I think that what has been pretty consistent is Donald Trump's vote share in the Republican primary, right? That it's in the sort of low 40s, that he's hanging out in that space. He was hanging out a little bit lower right after the midterms, a little bit higher now, but you're talking about basically 2 in 5 Republican primary voters. You know, you had to choose today, yeah, you'll go with Trump. The DeSantis number has moved around a bit, and I think the good news, if you don't want Donald Trump to be the Republican nominee, or if you're another Republican running for president, is 41, 42% is not a majority. The bad news is that, you know, neither is like 7%, which is what Mike Pence has these days, right? And I think it's basically, it comes down to a question of how you interpret the Ron DeSantis number. Is 35% or whatever for Ron DeSantis, is that really a vote for Ron DeSantis? Or is that a vote for, I've heard that name, I've seen him on Fox News, he seems like my kind of guy and he's not Donald Trump, right? And as you can tell from sort of how I'm presenting this, I personally fall into the second bucket of, I don't really believe that that is an educated, committed choice for Ron DeSantis. I believe it's a choice for somebody who's quite right-wing, but not Donald Trump. And that does leave quite a lot of space for somebody, whether or not that person's Ron DeSantis.
Okay, but let me put a different card on the table. After 2020, and in the ensuing January 6th fallout, the notion was about that, well, maybe now the Republican Party is going to get to where it was. And now you look at who's being elected at the state level, which I always think is one of the most undercovered stories and critical stories in American politics. And you are finding people in once moderate Republican states like Michigan who are electing, if I can use the technical term, wingnuts. I mean, people who are to the, I don't want to say right or left, people who are to the wackiness beyond of the people who ran and lost because they were too wacky. So it seems at the grassroots level, at least in a lot of these states. I mean, look at New York. New York is, right? Rockefeller, Lindsay, Javits, look at the New York Republican Party
There's
now.
no question. There's been a huge makeover of the New York Republican Party, which I would argue began before Donald Trump. I mean, I think it is important to bear in mind that Carl Palladino was the gubernatorial nominee in 2010 in this state. And that was a real harbinger of not just Tea Party energy of that campaign cycle, but of things to come. And so, but what's interesting about the remaking of these parties and what's interesting about Trumpism, and I'll just take Palladino as an example, Palladino was in many ways a progenitor of a Trump candidacy because he was somebody who made headlines for racist and sexist emails and for, you know, all kinds of personal problems. And that helped him with Republican voters. And then Trump comes along, absorbs the party and the Tea Party energy, and then Palladino runs again as a Trumpist last year in a congressional race in his district. I don't think it's a surprise that members of the party who are further to the right, or whatever you want to, whatever your terminology was, to candidates who ran in 2022, I don't think it's a surprise that they are not just emboldened, but also they are what's desired by a certain segment of the electorate. But what you're talking about in most of these cases are generally not statewide races, right? I mean, what are you, which example are you pointing to? And like,
I think, well, first of all, in Michigan, that's the state chair.
the state chair, sure. But
Okay.
these parties have been very Trumpified. There's no question.
That's what I'm saying. And I think if we wind up with Blake Masters and Kerry Lake running, I can't remember the Massachusetts Republican, is it Bolden?
You're thinking of New Hampshire, Baldock.
It just appears that these people are taking serious looks at significant offices.
They are, but they're winning. To your point, they are who win Republican primaries in a lot of these states now. And yes, it is more so in states like New York. But this energy has always been there. Is my only point.
You remember in 2016 the Jeb Bush line that the Republican Party has a successful Republican candidate has got to be willing to lose the primary in order to win the general election. He got the.
He certainly.
the first part.
He's 50% of the way there.
Got the first part right.
And now, you know, the party is totally oriented in the other direction.
Yes.
It's all about winning the primary.
That's right.
And, you know, we'll see what happens in the general election. I think there were a whole lot of people in the Republican Party last fall, I know there were, who really felt at the end of that midterm campaign, well, we nominated a bunch of crazy people, but the environment is good enough that we're going to get Senator Bolduc and we're going to get Senator Masters, right? And they didn't, right? So that really is the really bright neon warning sign for them.
Such a good point. No, it's absolutely true. I mean, we are all aware of all the reports in 2022 about a looming red wave that just absolutely didn't materialize. And to go back to your point about DeSantis' polling numbers and how they've kind of bounced around, DeSantis got a huge bump after 2022 because he was one of the bright shining lights for Republicans in the cycle. Since then, he has made some statements, most especially about Ukraine and Russia, that have caused some Republicans who are in the non-Donald Trump wing to give him another look.
Let's cross the aisle for a second. That's a phrase we pros use to describe the other party. Biden's job approval rating, which began to tick up, now ticking back down to under 40%. He gets really low marks on the economy, and I'm sure the Silicon Valley Bank did not help. And you've got White House, you've got the Republicans controlling the House who every day are going to have the investigation of the hour, with a Republican majority in the House that is committed, I'll use a neutral word, not your father's Republican House majority, that appears to be willing to go to the brink on default. And with Biden wanting to prove his bona fides and getting things done, where is the room for him to get things done?
Over to you, because I think you have a better thought on this than I do.
I think there's not a lot of room. I think you mentioned going to the brink on default. I think there's this sort of pre and post debt ceiling phase of this Congress, right? That I think between now and the time that we either raise the debt ceiling or default on our national debt and all start living in Bidenvilles, we'll see. But once we get past that point, there is some stuff where you can see the president finding common ground with not most Republicans, but like maybe enough Republicans, right? You saw in the last Congress on the CHIPS legislation, right, semiconductor policy to take on China's dominance in that technological space. There are Republicans in the Senate who you could see working with on, I'm not talking about, Inflation Reduction Act scale legislation or, certainly not like Affordable Care Act kind of stuff, but could you see some trade deals? Could you see some defense spending? Could you see some additional kinds of sort of China-oriented industrial policy? Maybe, but we're not talking, the most productive legislative phase of the Biden presidency is definitely behind us.
Yep.
There's one area that we didn't mention, which is on Ukraine specifically, where Biden has actually been able to forge a fragile, and this was the subject of a great column Alex did about 2 weeks ago, has been able to forge a fragile bipartisan coalition, and I think he's held it, and I'm not sure how that plays out going forward.
But even that coalition is under some stress.
That's what I'm saying. I don't know how this plays out going forward, because that's an area where McCarthy was very vocal in 2022, but it's often unclear with McCarthy how much of this is something he is saying to keep members of his party who could oust him in line versus something he's going to commit to.
I guess if there is good news for Biden, it's that the progressives seem to say, okay, he isn't what we wanted, but he's giving us enough and given the alternative. There's going to be no Bernie Sanders primary as of now, assuming Biden runs. There's going to be no challenge to him, I think, from the left, right?
It seems unlikely. I don't want to never say never because it's only March of the previous year before an election cycle. But no, I think that you saw Congressman Ro Khanna endorse Biden pretty fulsomely today and had said praising things about him to the Wall Street Journal. I think that was intended as a signal. Gavin Newsom made very clear a few months ago that he was going to take a pass. I think for a variety of reasons, but one of which I think, and maybe you'll both disagree with me, but I think Democrats in this climate with Trump looming do not want to be blamed as the person who made Biden weaker. And I think that we have seen basically a version of that since Super Tuesday, since the South Carolina primary in 2020.
Mm-hmm.
I completely agree with that. I think that there's this strange, from a certain perspective, strange dynamic in the Democratic Party where if you talk to progressives off the record, they will say, like, look, he's not everything we want. We'd much rather have somebody else, but like, we can do business with him, and if he doesn't run again, we could end up with someone much closer to the center. And they're right. And if you talk to people closer to the center of the Democratic Party, they'll say, look, like, he really seems like he has slowed down quite a bit. Don't love the idea of him being president at age 86. But if he doesn't run again, we could end up with one of these left-wing nuts, right? So they're all looking at each other sort of across the chasm of the Democratic Party and saying, like, well, I'll take my chances with Biden rather than rolling the dice on those guys.
And Trump becomes the glue that unifies once again.
Yeah.
So.
Now, you two are exempt from what I'm about to say, but for many columnists, when the deadline is approaching and it ain't kicking, you can always write, will the president dump the vice president? It's a hardy perennial. It probably goes back to when Jefferson got rid of Aaron Burr. But the question, can we just say, no, he won't, because it would be lunacy to drop the first black woman vice president when that's your most loyal part of the base? We just say
yes.
enough?
I think we can say that.
Yes.
Okay. I think we can say, though, that it is the lack of confidence that the Democratic Party has in Kamala Harris, and the lack of confidence that the administration projects in sort of not having for Kamala Harris, the lack of confidence they indicate they have in her. It is going to be a huge issue in 2024. The president is already the oldest president we have ever had. At the end of a second term, he would be the oldest president that we've ever had by a really wide margin. And I think if you had a vice president who, from the president on down, there was just this sense that, it's this hand-in-glove relationship, and there's nothing that he doesn't trust her with, and you throw her into the deep end of any pool and she'll be fine. I do think the age conversation will be really substantially different.
And to that point, there are a few topics on which the White House is as brittle as they are about Biden's age, and on which they try to project that this is something that is a media creation. It is not a media creation. When I speak to voters who are, sort of average information about politics, it is the thing that everybody mentions. This is not a confection.
All I can think of is the most significant liability in the media that Biden will face is the number 8. That is, you can't describe Biden without pointing out that he has just turned 80. And as somebody who is perilously close to that, Mark, I can tell you, I was telling you guys, when they're talking about an intelligence test that Nikki Haley wanted to pose to presidents, I know the test I want to ask a guy that old. Where are my car keys? What's the name of the guy who was in the movie with the bald guy who was with the bowling? And why did I walk into this room?
But Biden doesn't actually need to know the answers to 2 of those questions.
Okay, but beyond just the politics is the deeper movement of voters. And I think the Democrats, in a couple of recent studies, got some troubling news. The effort to bring back the white working class, which is a real passion for Biden. I want the kitchen tables up. I want to make unions stronger. And what these studies have found is that what is animating white working class voters to the Republicans is much more what are euphemistically called cultural issues and, quote, racial issues than the kitchen table issues. That they are gravitating to Republicans, many of whom are for cutting social benefits that might help them, because they resonate with their resentments, fears, sense that we're losing the country, it's not my country anymore, it's their country. How if you are, or maybe I should just put it, how does a Biden campaign propose to deal with that?
I think much the same way they have so far, right, which is not really to try to transform the political attitudes of the white working class, but to try to put enough of an economic agenda on the table to essentially stop the bleeding, right? That what Biden accomplished in 2020 was not to bring the white working class back to where it was, even when John Kerry was running and losing in 2004, but doing better with working class white voters, particularly working class white men. But to do significantly better than Hillary Clinton did in 2016, right? You're talking about losing these rural white counties by 60 points rather than 80 points, which actually is a pretty meaningful improvement, right? So if Democrats want to turn around the white working class, they're going to need to put together a really robust economic agenda. They have actually done a reasonably good job of that, though not as far as they probably need to. But they've moved where the party is on trade. They've moved where the party is on China in some important ways. And they would need to change some pretty fundamental cultural views that the party has. And that is where they have not moved one bit. And I think it is very, very difficult to talk to your white working class, rural, particularly male voter in a place like Ohio, a place like Iowa, and say, we've got this great semiconductor plant coming to town, so would you please also vote for all the stuff that you hate on gender and race and immigration?
The one hinge I would put on that, but it's minor, and I don't even know how detectable it is yet, if at all. Immigration is obviously an area where this White House is very concerned, and they have seen an enormous amount of blowback, and they have made moves that are clearly indicated at trying to shut that down as not just a Fox News issue, but an issue that might play with the same voters you're talking about. So, Biden, who ran in 2020 against Trump's immigration proposals and behaviors and actions, is moving ahead with policies that are pretty redolent of what Trump had at the border, and that gets very little coverage, but it's a real issue.
So one other thing that I would throw out there, and I agree with everything Maggie just said, I think there's a really important checkpoint coming up this spring for both parties, but it's tougher for the president. When the Supreme Court rules on racial preferences in college admissions.
Absolutely.
If you're suddenly in a place where the court has said there's nothing in the Constitution that says that this is okay, we need to take an act of Congress to make it legitimate to consider race in college admissions. They could even say that racial preferences of any kind in any kind of hiring at all are suspect under current law. What does the president say after that, right? And it's a really, really important test, Because if you talk to, more conservative white voters, they are white hot, no pun intended, just white hot in resentment about that kind of stuff. And if you talk to the president's base, much of the president's base, and I don't just mean voters of color, I mean progressive voters, younger voters, certainly voters of color, there's a really substantially different view of things. And that is just, it is coming up, it is a moment for choosing, it is really, really tough to sort of triangulate your way through that one.
And that, see, all of this is why one of the founders, if that's the right, of the theory that the Democrats were headed for a permanent majority based on demographics. The Emerging Democratic Majority was a book roughly 20 years ago, co-authored by a guy named Rudy Teixeira. In the years since, he has had a real change of heart. He's left a liberal think tank for a conservative one, and he says, what was wrong about this was, and even Ron Brownstein, who bought into this, says, here's what I was wrong about. The white working class became even more conservative, and there were defections from what I thought was going to be the new majority among Hispanics, among Asians, less so blacks,
But there too.
a little young.
Yeah.
So that the notion that every day another Republican died and another Democrat was born, that isn't how this worked out.
It isn't, and it is sort of in a counterintuitive way. It is a bit of a validation of the Bernie Sanders view of politics, right? That it's about class, right? That the notion that if you just add up the racial subgroups and sort of put white folks over here and you put everybody else over here, this group is getting bigger, this group's getting smaller. It just doesn't work that way, because it turns out that like a working class Hispanic man in some cases, in some states, is going to behave politically more like a working class white man than like a Hispanic
Yeah, but
woman.
Bernie thinks it's all about economics. The way you get these people back is to tax the millionaires and the billionaires. Well,
I don't
maybe
know
not.
that his solutions are sort of what the electorate is looking for, but the notion that it's like fundamentally about the material economy, I do think there's quite a lot to that.
Just taking you behind the scenes, folks. I don't know what time it was. It's not. She didn't get any report about. Oh, look, he's been indicted.
You're looking at
Bye,
my
Maggie.
text.
Okay, no, this is good because we have some time on this. Again, I'm a little reluctant to do this because it is a little in the weeds, but I just think it's so critical that one of the things that Democrats in particular totally forgot for years was the importance of down ballot measures. The loss, what happened in 2010 at the state level, I still think was the most significant political development maybe of this century, when I think 18 or 20 state legislatures went Republican, governors from one end to another went Republican, and all of these pieces of legislation, whether it was abortion or taxes or not expanding Medicare, not to mention the threat of them taking over the presidential election, flowed from there. Interesting, just this week, Michigan, which flipped all Democratic, repealed the right to work law. So I'm wondering whether or not, as we focus on Trump and Biden and all that, we don't want to take our eye off the ball that, for instance, keeping the U.S. Senate Democratic is going to be a very difficult proposition, assuming the Republicans don't nominate wingnuts. I mean, you want to talk about that a bit, and how concerned the White House is that they might lose that one house of Congress?
I think they're equally concerned for themselves right now about getting, because I do anticipate Joe Biden is running again. Everything that I have heard is that he is. I think that they are as concerned with their own reelection. But yes, there is, from the people I talk to, great concern that they will lose the Senate. They realize that they're holding on to it in 2022 and expanding their majority was a gift that they did not foresee. It's a tougher map in 2024, but again, that gets back to, the thing we haven't said explicitly tonight is the thing that is true, which is that Democrats, generally speaking, want to run against Trump. And while he is both described as, an enormous threat to democracy, and P.S. the person who they really want to run against. And so, which is actually a contradictory message that voters can tell is contradictory in some cases, but the hope is that he is going to usher in and guarantee and insist, because he's such a presence in the party, a series of Senate candidates who are a lot like the slate we saw in 2022, but you might have better thoughts on this than I do.
No, I have very similar thoughts than you do. I think the Senate's going to be very, very difficult for them next time. just the map is really, really challenging, and that extra seat, if the Senate had stayed 50-50, rather than becoming 51-49 in the Democrats' favor, I would say there's basically no chance that they could hold control after 2024, just in a scenario where you have West Virginia and Montana up before you even get to Ohio and Arizona and some others. It's just, they would really have to run the table, and they still basically do need to run the table. But Jeff, this is one more reason why you see the president sort of moving, I don't know if moving to the center is the right term, but certainly emphasizing the more centrist components of his platform and identity on crime, on immigration, on energy. You can't have any chance to reelect Joe Manchin or John Tester if you are running as a party that will not allow drilling on 1 acre of American soil and will not stop the DC City Council from making carjacking like a less heavily punished offense.
I'm wondering whether or not, I'm not sure it's in his character or temperament, this is your character, but I wonder if they ever have thought about a sister soldier moment. Just to refresh your memory, in 1992, there was a black gathering where a rap artist or hip hop artist named Sister Soldier said, if they're killing all these black people, why don't we start killing white people? And Bill Clinton went out of his way to criticize her, just slam her down. I don't mean that, it's too harsh. Really call her out on that. And there are those who felt that the Clinton campaign regarded this as not only the right thing to do, but from a tactical point of view, the idea that he was not a prisoner of identity politics may have helped him.
I think it's very hard for Biden to do, honestly, at this point. I think that they have, to Alex's point, I actually don't know that you can say he's moved toward the center. I think it is a question of emphasis in a lot of cases. And in some cases, it's a question of policy that they are moving on, but that they actually don't play, they calibrate pretty carefully how they address it publicly. I think that Biden ran such an identity politics-based campaign in 2020 and has generally led his White House that way with such an emphasis that it would be such a radical departure that I think it would be a problem. But I mean, do you think I'm wrong?
I think the other problem is, who do you call out like that,
Well,
right? That the party is.
I think the veto of the DC attempt to decriminalize carjacking was maybe as far as he would go, and he's taking heat from that.
And even then, it's not like you saw the president go out and talk about like the radical left has gone too far in this city, and I won't let the good people of Washington suffer under
That's
their.
not Biden.
No, that's not Biden,
Statement
right?
that they issued,
No, you get the discomfort is just the whole body language of it is just so uncomfortable, right? If we find ourselves in a position where next year Ron DeSantis is running for president, and the DC City Council passes some sort of new slate of education reforms that's just like with a gift wrapped with a bow for Ron DeSantis, like maybe we'll see Biden speak differently, but gosh, I don't even know who the Sister Soldier equivalent today would be.
We generally don't turn to anything international here because I have a limited vision and knowledge. But there is a story here that from abroad that seems to me to have some pretty political weight. On Thursday, the defense minister of Israel said to his party, he's Likud, we should slow down all this judicial reform stuff where they want to weaken the court power and let the court be over. And it's really causing a lot of trouble. Today, Netanyahu fired him.
And there was lots of fallout after that.
Well, my point is, Mr. Global Editor, bring it back home for us. I mean, it seems to me there's some pretty significant domestic American consequences of this. If you want to start in Israel, that's fine.
No, I mean, I think certainly if things continue on the current trajectory, the domestic fallout will be significant. I think you've already seen the Biden administration go farther in not sort of point blank attacking the Netanyahu government, but certainly muted diplomatic criticism of what they're doing. They've gone way further than I thought they would, praising the president of Israel for coming out and calling for pause and compromise and sort of emphasizing the importance of the rule of law and sort of basic civic institutions in a way it's barely even coded, right? Joe Biden is Israel's best friend in the Democratic Party at this point. I think it's almost unimaginable that we will see another Democratic president in the next couple election cycles who is as rock solid, unskeptical of the basic sort of proposition that Israel represents today. But Netanyahu is making it awfully difficult for him, Jeff. And when the and even before the judicial reforms were proposed, the formation of this government, which includes some really, really appalling characters, right, was you saw this reaction of the Democratic Party of like, God, this is the last thing we need, right, because it pits our, sort of more center-left Jewish base against our more numerous and more left-wing and Israel-skeptical sort of millennial and Gen Z base. And the further Netanyahu pushes this, the harder it gets for your sort of traditional, like Clinton-era democratic regime on Israel to sort of maintain its dominance of the party.
How is the left of the Democratic Party in Congress handling the traditional anti-war instincts with the amount of aid and support being given to Ukraine? I mean, I know there are a lot of Republicans, you're seeing a kind of a isolationist or neo-isolationist, why do we want to give them this money? But are there Democrats who are kind of returning to the roots of we don't want to commit American treasure, if not blood, to a foreign entanglement?
Not yet. I think that if you were to see the president go further than he's been willing to do so far in terms of committing American personnel or giving certain kinds of arms, I do think you would start to hear, certainly from the Congressional Progressive Caucus in the House, some real discomfort around, really, we want to give them arms that are capable of striking Moscow or whatever. Biden's not done that, and I don't think this is part of some grand strategy. I just think this is sort of like a bonus to Biden basically having this ponderous decision-making process. But I do think that I was in Brussels a couple weeks ago, and we were talking about, this was before the decision to commit tanks to Ukraine had been made. And the sort of question over there was, are the Germans and the Americans really just dragging their feet? Or is there a method to this where the idea dangles out there for so long that by the time you decide that you're going to give the tanks, it's really mainstream and nobody's going to be that upset about it, and Putin's not going to fire off any nuclear warheads, right? And I actually don't think it's a grand strategy, but I do think things have basically worked out that way.
So let me come back home. I realize that I keep reaching back into what for politics is the distant past, but one of the things about Reagan and the Reagan coalition was their total belief in American exceptionalism, American leadership, and the need for America to support other free countries. Now, sometimes that in practice did not happen. But Reagan, for instance, used to love to say one of his more interesting remarks, free nations do not make war on each other. And now you have a Republican Party that seems almost taken, almost kind of like a crush, if that's too trivial a word, with people like Viktor Orban of Hungary and Bolsonaro in Brazil. I'm going to leave out a couple of people because the leader of the Philippines. Anybody who is sort of a quote, and Putin to some extent.
I think to a great extent. I don't even think it's to some extent.
Okay.
I think it's
traditional values, opposition to unconventional lifestyles, all of that stuff. Now, is this all just the fallout of Trump, or is there something else going on here among these Republicans that where the whole notion of standing up for democracy just it seems to be going by the wayside almost?
Well, I think those are two different questions. I think the question of stand up for democracy and try to promote democracy and the ideal of freedom is something that we actually have not heard Republicans talking about for a long time.
Let me interrupt 1 second. Susan, if you've got questions, you can bring them out. Go ahead.
Sure. That's something that we have not heard the majority of Republicans, particularly Republicans in Washington, talking about for a while, and certainly since the Trump era. So that's one aspect. But even those Republicans can still value the idea of a strong democracy and think that that is the preferred form of government, and take issue with autocrats. Then you have Trump, who has, who spent many, many years admiring strongmen long before he became president. And part of his remake of the party has been a significant chunk of that base. Again, I'm not talking about most elected officials, but a significant chunk of that base who like the idea of the strong leader and therefore say admiring things about Putin or Orban. I mean, Orban spoke at a version of CPAC. I think possibly two of them. Bolsonaro spoke at CPAC. So that I do think is directly tied to Trump. But I think that's a further extension of the retrenchment of spreading democracy.
Okay, I'm going to turn to questions because Alex is not about to throw a temper tantrum. He has a hard out, as we say in the trade, at 8:30 for very good reasons that, frankly, he will keep to himself.
I'm being
Unless you
indicted.
Unless you choose to chair. I'm not, but there's some good questions here. I want to give you some. Discuss Rupert Murdoch's abandonment of Donald Trump and if it will affect his support within the base.
Not yet. I mean, there's a big, Rupert Murdoch has abandoned and come back to Donald Trump before, so I just want to note that if Donald Trump is the nominee. They have similar views of transactional needs. Fox and News Corp are not the same since Roger Ailes left Fox, and there was a time when Fox was really programming its audience, and now it is being led by its audience, and it is being led by different aspects of a feeder right-wing media ecosystem like Breitbart and Ben Shapiro and a bunch of others. And so I don't actually see evidence that, Rupert Murdoch's media empire has been all in for Ron DeSantis for weeks, and during that same period of time, DeSantis's poll numbers have gone down. So I don't think they have the same impact they once did. Do you disagree?
No, I agree with that completely. It's
Okay.
to me, it's a really, really interesting reflection of the limits of what Fox can actually do.
Totally.
What about Chris Sununu, governor of New Hampshire? Does he have a chance?
I think he could be elected president of the White House Correspondents Association. He's playing. My colleague at Politico, Mike Schaefer, did this great column a couple weeks ago about just how Chris Sununu is playing the Washington press corps like a fiddle, and it's totally true. He's just on every Sunday show. He's available for comment all the time. He's not running, and he might not run at all. And if I had to bet, I think he probably won't.
Why would you want to run in your own state and possibly not come in first, or even second? It's very hard for me to imagine.
But
the role that he could play, right? He's a popular Republican governor of New Hampshire. He's not been shy about being critical of Donald Trump. Could he help somebody else win New Hampshire? Yeah, I think he could.
Okay. Absolutely.
Okay. He may be eligible for what I call the political Lady Byng Award. Lady Byng is awarded the most polite player of the National Hockey League. And my analogy is there's always a candidate who the press falls in love with. He's honest, Bruce Babbitt, Paul Tsongas, like that.
Straight talker.
Say again?
No, he just tells it like it is, Jeff.
Yeah, there you go.
There's none of that Washington BS.
Talk about this doesn't have the tone of a normal 92nd Street Y question. Talk about Michael Cohen, a liar, and then ready to take a bullet for Trump, turncoat, I can't. It's hard for me to read. Anyway, talk about Michael Cohen. This guy does not like Michael Cohen.
Was there a question, or was it just talk about it?
Talk about it. There's a question mark at the end, so it's a question. It's like Jeopardy. Go ahead.
So, Michael Cohen is obviously, if Trump gets indicted in connection with these hush money payments to the porn star who claimed to have had an affair with Trump, that Michael Cohen, who was Trump's fixer and lawyer in 2016, paid at the end of the campaign. If that case goes forward, he will be a key witness. I realize whoever asked this question has some feelings about all of it. I am of the opinion that Cohen, I think that Trump allies and Trump's team are underestimating him as a potential witness, just in terms of, A, I think he has a fair amount of documentation, B, he sat through 7 hours of House public hearing testimony, and Jim Jordan tried to get under his skin, and Mark Meadows tried to get under his skin. Matt Gaetz attacked his wife on Twitter on his way into the hearing, and he never lost his cool once. So, I mean, I actually think that was equal, if not more, public strain. So, there, I talked about him. That's another question.
This is a 92nd Street Y question. Why isn't an ex-president held to a higher legal standard? I keep hearing we can't prosecute because of the presidency.
Well, in a way, if you don't prosecute on a bunch of things when he's not in office, there is an Office of Legal Counsel opinion by the DOJ that a sitting president cannot be indicted, but he's not a sitting president anymore. And so the argument that people make for indicting him is if you don't and you have evidence of a crime that's provable and you can get a conviction, then you are holding him to a higher legal standard. Because, I mean, take for instance, the investigation into his possession of classified material at Mar-a-Lago. Now, I realize he has since claimed he declassified it, but that's been pretty heavily disputed by federal officials. If any of the three of us were found to have one or two of those documents at home, we'd be facing a huge amount of legal trouble. So, you know, I think that whether the DOJ moves ahead with that or not, I don't know, but I think they have a compelling amount of evidence.
Yeah, it's the one thing that I'm getting really impatient about is whenever anybody of any side says no one is above the law. I mean, you want a list? It's aspirational, I understand, but it just makes my teeth go, here, let me show you. Got enough money, got enough power, you're above the law.
And that long predates Trump. I mean, it's just that the presidency
that is not about,
it's just in a different
for sure.
category with the
Some
former
might think it
president.
applied to a different former president who
A couple.
never
was
faced
gonna
the
say,
full
just
consequences of his
one?
behavior. Just saying.
Yeah.
Since you have to leave soon, I want to make sure you get this. This is something that I should have raised. What is your take on the future of the Democratic Party? Who are the up-and-coming or existing people who actually impress you as really good political folks? Let me start with you, Alan.
I think you saw a bunch of them come out of the midterms, right? And also come through the first couple of years of the Biden administration. I think it's one of the, as you know well, Jeff, one of the sort of misfortunes that you can have as a rising politician is to have your big moment when a president of your party is in the White House, right? Because if we were in the middle of a second Donald Trump term and a black preacher were to win 2 Senate elections in Georgia in 2 consecutive election cycles, for the Democrats, people would be talking about President Warnock, right? Or if we were in a second Donald Trump term and Gretchen Whitmer were to win re-election as governor of Michigan by a thumping margin, people would be talking about President Whitmer. And in fact, even though we do have a Democrat in the White House, I get texts like, it was more right after the midterms, but semi-regularly, is there any way we could get Whitmer Warnock? Would Warnock Whitmer be better? There are stars out there in the Democratic Party, but I just mentioned 2 of them. A couple more. I think the governor of Illinois, J.B. Pritzker, is really
New governor of
compelling.
Maryland?
I'm sorry?
The new governor
New
of
governor of Maryland. Wes Moore, I think, in the cabinet. Secretary Raimondo is very impressive. We obviously have a sitting vice president of the United States who's expected to run at some point. There's a reason why people in the party are not entirely sold on her, but she's a big figure and will presumably run at some point. The question for a lot of these folks is, if Biden runs again, and as Maggie said, I have every expectation that he will, do they have staying power for another 5.5 years, right?
Okay.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's the Tonight Show. Thanks, Alex. I'll only keep you about 10 minutes,
No
okay?
worries.
Now that he's gone.
We're going to do it this way every time now.
But there is one that comes up. You know, one of the more notable things from your book, one of many notable things, may I say, was when Trump described you to a phrase as you're his psychiatrist. Now, I don't know what your reaction to that was. Thanks a lot.
I was in the middle of an interview. He just kept talking. And I'm happy to tell you what I think of the
That's
line.
what I meant, now that he's not here.
So number one, I think it was a meaningless statement. I think it was intended to flatter. You know, I think that he has described his Twitter feed that way. I think that he has, described interviews that way. Everything is like therapy to him because he's acting as if it's therapy all the time, in real time, and he's kind of working everything out in front of all of us in real time. And I think that you're seeing some of that now. There was a Guardian story from earlier today about how Trump had a bunch of reporters on his plane he did a rally in Waco, Texas last night, which we didn't even discuss, but scheduled at a time when they thought he was going to have possibly been indicted already. And he had a bunch of reporters on the plane, and I guess an NBC reporter asked him, are you frustrated by this legal proceeding? And he basically did a version of, I'm not frustrated, you're frustrated. He said, he said, I'm not frustrated, this is all fake news, that's a stupid question, NBC's the worst, that's fake news, don't ask me any more questions. I'm not frustrated. So, that's an example of it, right? And then he gets asked about what will happen, and he admits he doesn't know what's going to happen, and then he says, actually, I think they've dropped the case already. Okay, so, I don't think this is somebody who puts a whole lot of stock in what he says to anyone at any given time.
But it's interesting to people, I'm not counting the people of highly limited understanding of journalism who think that when you interview somebody, and you quote what he says accurately, you're his tool. But you can't read Confidence Man and think, oh, this is a glowing portrait of a great president. And yet, does he still talk to you?
I've not talked to him since my third interview for the book, in which he made that psychiatrist comment, which was September 2021. And he was very angry over reporting that I put out 8 months before the book came out that he had been flushing documents down toilets in the White House and on overseas trips. And he put out a statement calling me maggot, and so that was that. So I have not talked to him since. He has sent me messages through various aides, but I have not talked to him.
Do you believe, you're still pretty young, that there will come a time when you will be working, New York Times, wherever, and you will not be writing about Donald Trump?
No, it's a good question. I don't see that time anytime soon. I mean, he's the front runner for the nomination, and this is not a question. This is not what you asked, but I will answer
Please.
this. There's a huge debate that's been going on, really forever, but certainly since he left the White House at the end of January in 2021, about just ignore him. It's all going to go. We are so well past that. And it's not because he makes it difficult, it's because he's running for president and he's leading the polls and he's facing an expected indictment, one of what might be 4. I mean, there are 4 investigations going on that we know of. So that's just not an option. And so not writing about him is also not an option for me right now.
Certainly not this year.
No, but it's, and I, not next year either, assuming he stays in the race. And then if he wins the nomination, then there's that. I think that we will be writing about him in one way or another, Jeff, for a long time, because as you noted when you were talking about his effect on state party chairs and on candidate quality of 2022, he has completely remade that party. Yeah. And so we are going to be talking about him for a long time.
I'll ask you this one last question, because I think that is A, accurate, and B, understates what he has changed. Mm-hmm. I think he has changed the culture. I think he has changed how people behave. I think he has changed, if not shattered, the limits of what's considered unacceptable behavior.
Well, that's definitely true.
In supermarkets, in classrooms, and on the street. I
guess the one caveat I would put on what you just said about how he changed, although I generally agree with it, there is a degree to which people's behavior and their understanding of how you function in public was really upended by the pandemic and by being behind, in your homes for months and months and months on end. I don't think that people acting insane on airplanes is because of Donald Trump. And there's been a huge amount of that since COVID.
Okay, that's.
I'm just saying that there's narrow areas, but I generally agree with you.
I mean,
that he has everything in politics right now in the country is defined by who you hate and who hates you back, and he has encouraged hating people and dehumanizing people and attacking, and that is his whole MO. And violence informs his idea of strength, and strength then informs his idea of what makes a leader. And that has had an enormous trickle-down effect. The way that I put it in the book was that what became clear after that ad he took out about the teenagers who became known as the Central Park Five, whose deaths he called for in that ad, that, it was as clear a guiding ethos as anything he had, which is that hate should be a civic good. And I think that we have seen that over and over and over.
I'm remembering that one of his chiefs of staff, John Kelly, who was brought in to bring order and calm in the Trump White House.
By Trump. Trump brought him in for that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Said at the end, at some point, he's the most flawed individual I have ever met. He didn't say the worst politician. He didn't say the worst public CEO. The most flawed individual
Yes.
I have ever met.
Yes. And I think he meant it. I mean, Kelly said to people in other settings that, he had never met someone like that. He had never imagined, I'm sorry, I'm going to get it wrong. He never imagined that somebody like that could exist outside of a prison or a mental institution.
And yet, there's one of the many books written about this era was called "Thank You for Your Servitude."
Yeah, the Mark Leibovich's book.
About why so many Republicans.
Yep.
And it's like this wasn't a secret, right? What John Kelly said.
Everybody, Alex and Jonathan's book, This Will Not Pass, Jonathan Martin, Alex's co-author, gets at this very precisely. Just this sort of, throw it all to the wind attitude of particularly congressional Republicans who just decided that, but the Senate too, who decided that their future and their ambitions rided on having Trump like them. So I will tell you a story that I was really kind of haunted by from the end of this week. And it really goes to your question of whether he can be elected again or not, with the huge caveat, as Alex said, and I completely agree with him. I thought it was a fantastic column that he wrote about how actually, no, getting indicted is not what you want in politics. But I got a call from somebody who I've known for a very long time, who's a Republican, 2 days ago, and they deeply disliked Trump. And they were saying, and had said to me after January 6, 2021, that they could never vote for him again, and that they believed he was done in politics. And this person first began with, what is Alvin Bragg doing? This is breathing life into him. And this has been a complaint that we've heard from a lot of people, which I think echoes that Michael Cohen question. And then the person said, I said, how is it breathing life into him? And we sort of went down the road, and they said, well, it's making people like me have to defend him. And then we talked about world events, and the person went on to explain that if I pushed them and said, you said you will not vote for Trump again, and the person said, if it is between Donald Trump and Joe Biden next year, I can't believe I'm saying it, but I will vote for Donald Trump. And what I said to this person was, this is not Alvin Bragg breathing life into him. This is people looking for whatever rationale they can to get themselves okay with doing it. And so whatever bars, to your point on conduct and what he has created a permission structure for, I would flip it a little bit and say, he has created a dynamic where, what used to previously be a bar for entry in politics is generally out the window, and we are likely about to find out whether an indictment qualifies.
And on that note,
Happy
for the
Sunday,
sixth
guys.
time, Maggie, thanks so much.